In the middle of tremendous darkness and personal tragedy, false lights are trying to guide us, and they can bring shipwreck. We must be focused on God's pathways and His light in the storms of life. Christ is the light of navigation. Hello, and welcome to the Light of Navigation and the God Stories. My name is Marguerite Lever-Woodall, and I'm an author, speaker, and your host. I write short stories about real-life supernatural encounters with God, and I love to explore what it means to follow God's pathways. In this 9th episode of the God Stories, called God and the Liar, God's divine visitation and intervention at a crucial point in my life saved my life. This was an epic battle between the truth and the liar, and the truth won. Come, join me in the adventures of the God Stories and experience the encounters with the goodness of God, even in the middle of our life storms. I stood in the doorway of my home, listening on the phone as the physician spoke. It was cancer. Here I was, getting ready to leave to attend my first grief support group meeting that night, when I received the doctor's call. I can't begin to describe the feelings of lostness, pain, and fear that I was experiencing in those moments. It felt like the other shoe had finally dropped. In the middle of grieving over the loss of my son a year and a half earlier, I wondered how I was going to cope with this and all it entails emotionally, mentally, and physically at the same time. The voice of fear began to whisper to me, bringing to my mind every imaginable scenario. Scenarios of impending doom and death paraded through my mind from the diagnosis I'd just been given. There's a stronghold of fear in my life, and it has plagued me on many fronts for many years. Fear is multifaceted. There's the fear of death, the fear of lack in our finances, fear for our loved one's safety, fear of the unknown, and the list goes on and on. And those fears rise at various times to try and consume us, like a wildfire, if it can. As I walked across the church parking lot that night to attend the grief share meeting, I shared the cancer diagnosis with one of my closest friends in a phone call. But before I could even go into the building for that meeting, God stepped into my moments of pain and fear. In the middle of the phone conversation, my friend was overtaken by a move of God's Spirit. She began describing an image God was revealing to her in those moments. He showed her a bonfire with a spirit of fear dancing around it. It was throwing its lies into the fire as fuel to cause it to flare up and grow larger and spread. God was supernaturally revealing the raging battlefront that was coming against me in my mind. This demonic spirit of fear was trying to shift my focus mentally and emotionally with its lies of impending doom to try and consume me. She was being shown the battle in my mind spiritually, as the enemy was trying to convince me that I would die from the cancer. In the moments that followed during the movement of God's Spirit, His voice came through suddenly, boldly, and with unmistakable clarity through my dear friend. The change in the tone of her voice was not of this earth. God spoke and said, "Whose report will you believe?" I was frightened and stunned at the same time. I wasn't sure if he was speaking about the diagnosis itself being in error, or that the cancer meant my imminent death. I replied and asked God, "Which report do you mean, Lord?" And he said, "The report from the enemy that this means your death, or my report that it does not." As the terror of the Lord surrounded me completely in those moments, he asked again, "Whose report will you believe?" God's presence permeated the atmosphere all around me in that parking lot, as the fear of the Lord hit me like a ton of bricks. He was demanding an answer. I quickly replied out loud, "I will believe the report of the Lord." My response was hardly past my lips when God revealed to me an interpretation or understanding about a part of a vision I saw the day my son died a year and a half earlier. There was a part of this vision that I had not understood before, and it had baffled me for some time. In this vision, I saw a tall red and white striped lighthouse that was situated on a large, solid rock outcropping with a safe harbor behind it for incoming ships. I knew it was the true light of guidance for the ships that approached and could be trusted to guide them to the safest harbor. The lighthouse represented Christ. There was a second harbor with an extensive beach further down from the lighthouse's location, and I saw 3 bonfires on it. Historically, local islanders or passing pirates would light bonfires on these beaches to lure unsuspecting ships that were seeking safe harbor as storms at sea were approaching. There were hidden reefs underwater in the harbor that tore the ships apart instead. The result was shipwreck and the ship's cargo floating ashore for the island's natives or pirates to gather as plunder. What confused me was the number of bonfires on the second beach in the vision. It was a mystery for me for some time, and I had wondered often, why was there 3 of them instead of just 1? It was in those moments, as I stood in the church parking lot, that I received the interpretation of what those 3 bonfires represented. The revelation came quickly, just after the Lord spoke. The first bonfire represented the death of my husband in 1988. His death was meant to shipwreck a deeper commitment I had made in my life towards God at that time, and to cause me to question God's goodness. The second bonfire represented the death of my son Randall. This also was meant to shipwreck my faith and my trust in God with regard to my son's salvation. I had momentarily assumed the third bonfire was representative of my death, but God's Spirit corrected me quickly. The third bonfire was the fear of death that I needed to face and overcome by trusting God as I had never trusted Him before. The spirit of fear was trying to stoke the flames of the third bonfire with the lies of imminent physical destruction and death from the cancer diagnosis. It had intended to try and strip me of my faith and trust in God once again. However, the Lord had intervened into those moments to speak through a friend and rebut the lies the fear was trying to prompt me to accept. Sleep was a welcome relief from a tumultuous and agonizing day, to say the least. As I slept that night, I kept hearing someone singing a song to me. I thought to myself, whose voice is this? The mysterious voice sang this song over and over again to me into the early morning hours, and I woke up with its words still ringing in my ears. The song was called "Fear is a Liar." Why was this voice emphasizing this song as I slept? This was not a mental recollection from listening to a song on the radio. It was a literal voice of some sort that was sweetly singing it to me on a personal level all night long, over and over again. I instinctively knew God was trying to communicate something. So the next morning, as soon as I could, I quickly searched the internet on my computer for this song. And there was an urgency in my spirit as I did so. And I learned the songwriter was Zach Williams. I was only interested in the lyrics, not the video, I told myself. What were the words in that song? I remembered vaguely hearing it on the radio a couple of times, but I hadn't paid attention to the song's words. It must be important for me to know the lyrics, I thought to myself. The official music video on YouTube that I found showed several life scenes that expressed the message of the song's lyrics, as most music videos do. The successive scenes depicted how a spirit of fear was trying to bring destruction into people's lives with its lies. The message each time after each scene was that fear is a liar. As the words of the song were displayed, there was the scene of a man who was attempting suicide because of a job termination. A second scene was of a young woman's emotional agony as she faced the bullying of her peers at school. But one scene stood out from all the rest that played out before me, and my world stopped as I watched it. In the last scene, a mother kissed her fingertips, then lovingly touched a photograph on the living room wall of her home. The framed photo was of a dead son. Then moments later, in the video's next scene, she picked up a pamphlet from her coffee table, and the title read, "Coping with Cancer." Short scenes followed, showing the effects of the cancer treatments and its toll on her. There were the moments of crippling physical weakness from chemotherapy, and her hair falling out onto her comb in front of her bathroom mirror. In addition to it all, she was grieving for a lost son. There it was, my story. The story of the devastating grief over the death of a son, then a cancer diagnosis shortly after, and it was playing out in front of me in the video. I broke down as I watched and sobbed openly at the table in front of my laptop where I sat. The song's music and its words surrounded me in those moments as I wept, and God's personal message for me was very clear. Fear is a liar, Marguerite. In the middle of all these events, another close friend had offered to pray for me at a prayer group's weekly meeting. That evening, when I shared with her about God's message, how he had sang a song to me in the middle of the night, and the video he had led me to view that morning. Her astonishment was evident as we spoke. She said, "Marguerite, that's the song we played specifically for you, as we prayed for you that night." In the middle of life's storms, we must not be distracted by the light of the enemy's bonfires of lies. Those lies will erode our faith and consume us. They can shipwreck our faith in God. Jesus Christ is our lighthouse. In our trials and suffering, God will set us free from our fears if we allow Him to do so. Through my son's death and this cancer issue, the stronghold of fear in my life is coming down brick by brick, and I'm overcoming the fear of dying and many other fears as well. When one has overcome fear, we are free to live, laugh, and love. Then we become free also to share the love of God, because there's no fear of losing anything anymore, and we have everything to gain. I have the promise of heaven and uninterrupted time with the living God in my future, as well as with all of my family who've gone before me. Whom or what do I have to fear? I listened to the song and I watched the video a second time the following morning. I didn't want to ever forget God's special message for me. He had sung a song to me in the night, asking me to trust Him and to know that fear is a liar. When the video ended, and as I reached over to shut off the music, the next song on the random playlist began. And it was another Christian song titled "You're Going to Be Okay" by Jen Johnson. What? I'd never heard this song before, I thought. As I chuckled to myself, that just had to be a coincidence, right? 5 minutes later, I was in my car headed for work that day. As I turned my car on, the radio began to play. The first song that played? You guessed it. Fear is a liar. And God threw down the mic. Thank you for taking time once again to listen to my story. Whose report will you believe? If this podcast would encourage someone you know who battles a stronghold of fear, please pass it on. Your comments are valued, and subscribing would also be appreciated. In the next episode of the God Stories, called God, the Van, and the Property Tax, I learned that God can bring financial help through unfortunate mishaps we think are just terrible. And He's also a top-notch lawyer or advocate when it's needed. You don't want to meet God in a courtroom.